Okay, so now I'm going to talk about controller database housekeeping. So we're going to look at some of the technical things you can do in your controller database to try and keep it nice and tidy. So I've just got a test system here. I'm just going to very briefly log on to a test database and just first of all show you something that you should be doing about once a month, and that is a database optimize. You would make sure there's no other users in the system, and you go into single user mode, and then you click on this optimize button there, and here we've got ourselves into this screen. Now this is the sort of task that only the finance super users would be using. It's not like an IT department task to be done, and they would go in and periodically get into this menu. Now it's very rare that you'd want to do remove period zero values, so we won't talk about that. But you might just typically tick the box to rebuild the SQL database indexes. It's kind of optional doing this because in theory you have got a SQL maintenance routine running on your SQL server to automatically do this. But just in case your SQL DBA has not done that, then the controller super user can tick this box to make sure that the SQL indexes get rebuilt. And we press play, and it will go in the background and it will rebuild these structured tables, which is basically just some internal SQL databases. It's just going to clean up, and it's going to rebuild these indexes. And this is a very small database, so it should finish quite quickly, but your database, it could take anything between 10 minutes and even up to an hour if it's a massive database. But this is something you'd normally do once a month. Okay, so the database has finished optimizing. So what other things can we do? Well, to have a look at the controller database, I'm going to go into SQL Management Studio, which I've already got open up here. This is the database I was looking at. And what we're going to do is I'm going to just first of all show you the size of the database tables that you might have. So this is a very small database. It's a demo database here, and there's different methods to look at the size of the tables. I'm going to run this script, which I've used for many years, and I'm just going to run it, and it's a nice script, and it orders everything in database table size. Obviously yours is going to look different from mine, but this gives you an idea of some of the tables that you might see near the top. Yours will look slightly different. If you haven't got this script, which you can get from the IBM website here, if you haven't got a log on for this IBM website, then don't worry, you can do something pretty similar by just right clicking on this and choose reports, standard reports, and disk usage by top tables, and it'll run and you'll see something fairly similar. Okay, so I'm just going to very briefly talk about some of the tables that you may want to do a little bit of housekeeping for. So we're going to first of all talk about the table XDB audit. So on mine it's fairly small, yours might be huge. So let's go back into this controller, and that table handles all the changes to your data that you've done. It records it. It'll only be active if you've enabled the audit log. So I'm going to go into this button, and I'm going to have a look at my database. And I can see that the audits are not enabled on this database. So you probably have both of these ticked on your system, which means you can audit. It'll be recording all the changes you make to the structures, in other words, the configuration inside it, plus it'll be recording all the data changes. So basically, XDB audit, this is the table that we're talking about, and this stores all the information, changes to the data that you've done in controller. So anytime you change a value of a something like say an account, you've changed the value of the account for a particular company for a particular period, then that'll get recorded in here. So obviously every single month you're storing more and more data and you're making more and more changes. And so this audit table just gets larger and larger and larger. And you probably don't need to know about who changed what data value 3 years ago. So there comes a point when you think this really could be trimmed. So you might make a decision that you want to trim XDB audit to only store the amount of data for the last, say, year. So it'll only store the changes that people have made in the last year, and everything older than a year you can forget about. Well, you can easily delete that by going into the same menu that we saw earlier. So maintain, system audit log configuration, and you can choose how many days you want to keep your data for. So let's say you want to keep it for just keep the last year's worth of data. You can do that 365 days, press delete, and it will delete all the audit information. So all the changes that have been recorded of the data for the last, it'll just keep for the last year. So I already have a very small audit log. That won't have made any particular difference, but you can get the principle of what's happened. Okay, so what's the other tables that you might be interested in? Well, another one that can be very, very large is this one called, where are we? Exact log. So exact log contains all the company locks information. So every month, different users log on representing different companies around your organization, and they put in their data. But when they're finished putting their data in, you might lock that company. So that company, for that account, for that period, cannot put more information into the system, and you lock it as a super user. And then you can do stuff with that data, like run consolidations, for example. However, once the period is finished, that monthly period is over, you never really want to reopen that system. You would close the period for that month, so it can never be changed again, and therefore those company locks are superfluous. So just to recap that, when end users put their data into the system, you would normally create a company lock, but when the month is finished, you create a period lock, which completely closes the entire period's worth of data. Therefore, no one can make any changes, whatever their company is. So those company locks become superfluous. So you don't need these entries in exact lock. Basically, you don't need them more than a month. However, just to be on the safe side, you might want to just delete all the company locks that are older than, say, 3 months old, because then you can still look at the past 3 months and work out who locked the company at what date, if you're interested in knowing that. So how do you trim all these entries inside exact log? Well, in the olden days, you would have to run a script. So, oops, I'm in the wrong, there we go. So you run a script, and the script is this one. And you would choose which month is the oldest period you want to keep. So let's say I wanted to keep all the company locks from 2025 period 1. So for a lot of customers, that means January, but not necessarily. So let's just imagine in this company, it's January 2025. And you want to keep those and any newer ones. You would run this script. Obviously, if you wanted to do it, say, for 2024 June, you'd change it to that. But anyway, so we're going to run this script, and all it does is it copies all the locks into these temporary folders that are newer than 2501. Then it it truncates the original and then puts the values back into this exact log. And that will just trim it. And the process will take anything between 1 minute and 20 minutes or so, depending on how large your database is, how many locks you've got, that sort of idea. Okay, so what are some of the other tables that you might want to trim? Well, there is another table. Let's look at all the tables. So if I expand, you will see there are an awful lot of tables. But one of the tables down here is X stage fact. There we go. Now, X stage fact is only used by some customers, and it's used when you use import from staging tables, and it'll contain values that look something like this. And it's a method of getting information from a separate system, let's say your general ledger, into a temporary table, which is X stage fact in Controller, and then you import them into your system using an import specification. Right, but once that data's been imported, you don't need this the information that's in the X stage fact. This is just a temporary staging area, because what's happened is the data that's in the staging area has been imported into the correct table. So they've gone into like another table in here. So there's XDB with the letter, so with the numbers of the year afterwards. Anyway, so once it's gone into those XDB tables, you don't need any more in X stage fact. So you want to trim the data that's in here. Now, there is a method of doing that. And we go into this one. And you can see that there is a button for deleting import from staging tables. You choose how many days you want to keep of data. In this case, I've chosen to keep 31 days of information. So anything older than 31 days will get deleted once I press this button. So press this button and I do yes. Now this can take some time. If you've got a massive database and you haven't done this for ages, so you maybe haven't cleaned it out for years and years and years, then you might time out, but eventually this will come back with a success message. So earlier on, I talked about the exact lock. Now, the method I showed you, which was to run this script, works in all versions of Controller. However, if you're on the very latest versions of Controller, so anything that was released within about the last 6 months or so, well, in other words, mid 2025 onwards, then you will find there's a new button, which means you don't have to run this script. So if I go to maintain database optimize, there is a button called condense exact lock. And you can basically do exactly the same as the script does. Choose your period from which you want to keep your exact lock entry. So I chose this in the script. I could do the same thing. And I just press that button. And it will have done the same thing as I did earlier, which is to get rid of all the exact lock entries that are older than 2501. Okay, so I've now shown you how to trim some of your tables in Controller. I would probably say that the first task I showed you, which is the database optimizer, will be every month you'd want to do that. And then the other tasks that I've shown you about exact lock and XDB audit and things like that, you could choose to do that every month, but I would probably say about every 3 months is about right for most customers.